restrictiveness of it. And in those days, my class at Caltech was 39 before the war. There'd been 15 years of depression. There's very little construction. Full-fledged engineers and architects were trying to get jobs at that time and offered to work for nothing. Their fathers would support them, and they wouldn't hire them because just the distraction they'd cause asking questions would make the office less productive. And so these poor guys couldn't get a job no matter what they did, and they never ended up in architecture and engineering, many of them. See, mine was later. Mine was 39. These were guys who graduated in 33, 34. But when I graduated in 39, things were beginning to pick up because of the war. I mean, Hitler was going really wild in Europe. The Japanese were real menacing, and Russia was our enemy, not our friend. Everything was against us, so we were really starting to prepare for war. And that's when I graduated, so I got a job. That's when school called me up, said they had this opening in Hawaii. And I went to Hawaii, so we were luckier than the guys ahead of us. You know, Life magazine made a survey. It was very interesting. Back in the 50s, they surveyed different classes that had graduated during the Depression years, not in architecture and engineering, just in anything. And they found that with the class of 33, the pit of the Depression, all of whose members had to go somewhere during the war, that after the war was over, several years had gone by, and they were in this survey, they by a very large majority, these guys said the most fundamental thing in their life was the Depression, not the war. The Depression actually scarred them more, because in the war, everybody knew it was temporary. Everybody knew, this is crazy, we're not going to live this way forever. But in the Depression, everybody thought, we're going to live this way forever. If we're ever going to adjust, we got to do it now, because things aren't going to change. Well, of course, things actually did change, tremendously. But the Depression really changed people, changed me. It marked me forever to be conservative as far as money was concerned, fiscally. And, most people probably think the war was a great change, but it wasn't.
Do you think the Depression affected the way you do business too, and the way you
definitely, absolutely. Because with me and with many other people from the Depression, we didn't take big risks fiscally. We might take risks in our profession, with architecture and engineering. In fact, we did, but not fiscally. The guys that came along later would do stuff like they'd get a big job, so they'd go out and hire a whole bunch of men and buy a new automobile and move their offices, and then they didn't get a second big job, and then they'd get wiped out. And that didn't happen with guys like me. I never went to a bank to finance my payroll. I financed it out of my own cash. I wouldn't hire men until I had the cash to pay them. It's just that it really burned you, where you'd better know that you can cover anything you sign up to do. Oh, you are?
We made a
I mean, this is kind of off the subject, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Oh, not?
It's right on the subject, I would think. And did it also affect your use of materials and the techniques that you tried to find, to be somewhat fiscally conservative and also just economically?
Well, no, it didn't. See, the other thing that it did is that, like it did with me, and I'm sure it did with other guys, is that it meant that you are going to have to study your whole life and continue to perfect yourself because jobs are scarce, competition is fierce. The only way you're going to get ahead is to get better. So it made me embark on a lifetime career of going to school, of studying on the side. I was still going to school when I was 70 years old, going to college. Because I had to keep learning. I had to keep getting better and better, I thought. And so, no, it didn't really make us conservative in our approach to architecture. In fact, we were, the generation that I belonged to was very experimental. And this was part of the push, you know, we got to learn something new, we got to do something different. Like with shells. Shells were not being done in the United States at all. And I started seeing pictures of these buildings coming out of South America and in Italy and Spain. They happened to be all Latin countries. And I thought, God, how do they do this? You know, these three-dimensional curved structures. And so I started looking into it, and I found out that I couldn't find out how to design them. I mean, nobody talked about it. In fact, I realized after many years of striving that a lot of them really didn't know how to design them. They were just doing it intuitively. And that was not satisfactory to an engineer. I needed to know a rational way of doing it. And that sent me back to school and sent me to studying. And it took me years and years of very hard intellectual work to find ways to do this. And then when I finally did it, I was one of the few guys in the country that had really made that much effort. And so I became a pioneer in it. But then others went into other things, you know, like T.Y. Lin was doing his pre-stressed concrete and other fields of experimental engineering architecture.
Who were some of the architects that you saw those thin shell structures? So was it like Nervi or Candela?
Yes, the greatest of them all, in my opinion, was Nervi. And I believe that he was the greatest. First of all, he did a tremendous volume of work. Now, Torroja from Spain was very good, but the bulk of his work was quite small. And then Candela came along, and Candela was very experimental and very creative, but he stuck almost entirely with the hyperbolic paraboloid form of the shells. And so he did a lot of buildings and a lot of great buildings, but they were kind of limited in that they were all of this one type. But Nervi stuff was all kinds of different stuff, precast. And Nervi had a laboratory in Milan, in Italy, where he made experimental models. And Torroja had a lab too, but Torroja finally became pretty much of just a professor, didn't do a great deal of volume. But Nervi kept on doing these things his whole life, and working with models and working with whatever theory he could learn. And like the great lamellar roof hangar he built before the war that the Germans finally blew up when they had to retreat from Italy. It was a magnificent structure and a huge structure. And the other two guys, Torroja and Candela, were excellent engineers, and Candela became a friend of mine later on. I became fairly well acquainted with him. But they never had the tremendous variety and the huge buildings that Nervy did. So Nervy's the guy that I really admire the most of all.
So when you saw these designs, how did you figure out what the engineering and how to actually make them? And what was one of your first experiments with that? Was that the King's Coal Market?
Oh no, the King's Coal Market, the King Coal's Market is not a shell. It has a kind of a shell form, but it's not a shell. It's a wood roof. It's a wood arches. No, the first building I did, the first shell I did was in Honolulu. And there I worked with an architect that I'd worked with at the Navy Yard named Pete Wimberly. And Wimberly's architectural firm went on to become one of the biggest in the world. It's Wimberly, Wisden, Allison, and other names kind of came and went. But it's a huge outfit today, mostly in the entertainment field with hotels. But Pete and I were good friends, and when I'd go to Honolulu, I'd stay at his house. And we'd start barnstorming at night about supposing we did this, supposing we did that. And the more we drank, the more we barnstormed. And but you know, so a lot of our stuff was just crazy talk, but a lot of it was freeing ourselves of inhibitions that later on we remembered. And Pete had a very good intuitive sense for structure. He could sort of guess a structure that would make sense. But in this particular case, the first shell I did was a bowling alley near Pearl Harbor, and it's just single curvature shells, cylindrical shapes, which are single curved, and it was a span of about 93 feet, and I did it, and I could not find any way that it was really engineered. That other shells were engineered. If you tried to find it, you'd never get an answer. You'd always get some kind of double talk is what it would amount to. And the world didn't have translations of everything then like it has now. If a guy did something behind the Iron Curtain, it stayed behind the Iron Curtain. It was written in Russian or some kind of language that nobody in the U.S. spoke. So the way I finally did it, I figured out that it must behave an awful lot like a beam, just a simple beam, even though it was a singly curved structure. And so largely I figured it that way, and it worked fine, and it's still up, and it was quite thin. It was 2.5 inches thick, and that was pretty daring, and it worked fine. Now, what got me into shells, by the way, was a building in South America. I've got pictures of it, and it absolutely enchanted me to where I thought, my God, what a beautiful building. It was in Caracas, I think it was. And I never could find out anything about the architects or engineers, but it's a baseball stadium, and it was this doubly curved thing. The difference between doubly curved and single curved is that if you have a cylinder, it's singly curved, that it's only bent in one direction, not the second direction. But if you take say a sphere, it's bent in all directions. So a sphere is doubly curved. But this thing is something the architect chose, and I saw this thing, and all I'd ever known from going to school and the buildings that were around me, the buildings were being built in those days, were boxes, very uninspired things. And here I see this picture of this gorgeous shell, which you're probably going to want a picture of. I can find it. And it just enchanted me. I thought, my God, what a beautiful structure. But how on earth's name does it stand up? How did the guy do it? And that is what really made me decide, I got to do this. I got to get the answer to this. how is this done? And that's what set me off on years and years of searching before I finally found a way to do it. And when I finally did a building with my system, I say it's my system, that's not really true. I searched around into the theory of shells until I understood the theory very well. And then I started looking for ways of solving these things, and I found out they did not exist in the structural engineering profession. That is the architectural structural engineering profession. They did not exist. And fortunately, at that time, we had here a very huge aerospace industry. And I had friends at Lockheed. And I got in touch with a guy at Lockheed. And I talked to him. And they had ways of solving very difficult problems because they were building the rockets that later on went all through the solar system. And so I found this way of doing it. And it was a very tedious, complex way of doing it. But you would get an actual true answer. And what it was done really the same way that it's done today with computers. But the difference today is instead of doing this manually by hand, you turn it over to a computer who does 1 million calculations a second. But you could do it my way. But the way you had to do it, you took two guys, you set them side by side. I was one of them. The guy working for me was the other one. And they go through it step by step. And then every whatever period they decide, they get together and compare the answer they have. Then they go ahead again. Then they get together and compare to make sure that they don't go off. Because if you go off in a direction, you're never going to get the answer, you know. And so you can do it. You can get an answer. You don't get it down to the 4th or 5th decimal point. Like the smallest I could get chunks of the shell to work with would be about 2 feet square. This is a theoretical 2 feet. And today with a computer, you can get down to 2/10 of an inch if you want. And so we do it, and we actually got numerical answers for it. But it was such a tedious, horrible way of working that I never used the system again. By then, I'd learned enough that I knew ways of shortcutting that were not as accurate as that method, that rigorous method I just described, but that were close enough. And by this time, I developed a pretty good feel for things. And so I'd cut shells in pieces in my mind, put them back together again, and put them in equilibrium. And, I'm getting awful technical here. But from this, I finally found my way of doing things. But when I did this shell that I was describing, as far as I know, nobody had ever done it that way, a shell before. They'd done aerospace stuff this way. But you go to rocket, they put 10 guys on it, not 2 guys. And they have unlimited funds, And, but I never claimed I was the first, because another thing I found out, if you made a claim that you were the first at doing anything, just sure as heck, some guy from behind the Iron Curtain was going to come out and say, no, comrade so-and-so in 1888 did it, and it's published, and then he named some publication that you never heard of and you couldn't get a copy of, and you could never get a real answer. I don't know whether they were telling the truth or not. And so I never claimed those things. Several times I did things that I thought were the first, but I just said it's not universally used or known or something like that. Because otherwise you're going to look like an idiot. You claim something and then they come out and they really do prove that you weren't. And so this is the way that you finally end up, you're doing something that you're not really aware of yourself, which is you're developing a very sophisticated, intuitive way of working with these things, where you can just kind of take them and you can say, it doesn't look right, which is the way architecture was done all through the Middle Ages, all in fact in antiquity. Was they didn't have engineers, all they had were architects. And the very word architect, so is derived from architectural technician, like the guys that built the cathedrals and all. And so that's the way I got into it, from that one building, and then from finding out I just didn't know what I was doing until I just kept going back and back and back.
So tell me, what does a structural engineer actually do?
Well, the structural engineer does the structure. And this could mean anything. Typically, the structural engineer works, of course, with the architect. The architect is the arch technician, the guy in charge. The structural engineer does only the structure. He doesn't do elevators and plumbing and air conditioning and all 1,000 other things that have to be done with a building. And his contribution can be from very minor to very major. And what I mean by that is that I have had buildings where I've been picked to do the engineering, where the architect had laid everything out and I was just now to figure it. Now this could be, say you had a typical office building and you had a bunch of beams and columns and girders and conventional construction. The architect has really decided everything and you just run the numbers off. And so the engineer does very little creation. Now I've had, excuse me, other buildings like the ice rink, for instance, where the architect had to produce a building very cheap. The guy that was building it was a daredevil ice skater, jumping over cars and stuff. And he didn't have a lot of money. And so the architect said to me, come up with something that doesn't cost much. And so I started completely from scratch. And there I ended up with a complicated, doubly curved structure that solved all of the architectural and, of course, engineering requirements. So in that case, I determined the whole shape and everything on it. And the architect's contribution was minimal. And so that was the range. In many cases, like with Wimberley in Honolulu, it would be a collaborative effort between the two of us, where we'd start out and we'd say, let's do this. And then, no, that doesn't seem to work good. We'll do this, we'll do that. And one guy'd say, no, I think that's going to work. I like it. The other guy'd say, no, I don't think it will work. And we'd go back and forth like this and finally come up with something that we both agreed was the best way to do it. And so that is what the structural engineer does, to answer your question. And of course, there are many engineers that didn't like doing it this way. They liked the where it's all planned out. They liked calculating, just having it handed to them, calculated. This was their ideal job. They didn't want to get into all this unknown stuff. And because I actually liked doing this, I had sort of certain fields to myself. Now, for instance, I love doing foreign work. Like in Baghdad, I worked on a Hilton Hotel in Baghdad, and you had nothing given to you. You went there, you didn't know what materials were there. There was nobody there that could really tell you anything. And so you started from scratch. You had to root around and find out how to do it yourself. Well, I found that to be really a lot of fun and to be very exciting. I could come up with new stuff, and nobody's going to say, you can't do that, that breaks the law. But most, I'd say far more engineers didn't want to do it that way than did want to do it. And more the typical building that engineers wanted was a great big box where they could just go in and really zip through it, you know, do 100 beams a day and so forth. And so that again distinguishes between the two extremes of structural engineering.
Well, it sounds like for you it was much more of a challenge to, you know, work on different types of projects or with architects who really relied on you to come up with some kind of ingenious technique.
Well, yes, as time went on, of course, and I got some of these buildings under my belt, and they didn't have trouble with them, you know. And as the general attitude toward architecture was becoming more experimental and more daring, the engineers that didn't want to do this sort of thing were sort of, well, they went with the architects who were the same way. And the architects who were more interested in the in experimental things themselves began seeking me out because there weren't that many guys around town doing it, or at least guys who'd done buildings of any size. Probably guys that had done little buildings, you know, but architect gets a big building, he doesn't want to turn it over to a guy who's never did anything very big. And so that is the way that my practice grew. And, you know, and then I became known better in different parts of the country and all, and I got jobs eventually over a pretty good part of the world.
And you mentioned before about LA being open to new ideas. So can you talk a little bit about that, of like what Los Angeles was like in, you know, the 1950s and 1960s, and who some of
I can. I'm probably not as good as that as other people would be, because I was really a part of it, and I can't stand aside and see it, you know, like somebody else could. Like I only lived in LA after the war, and so compared to other parts of the country, I don't have that broader perspective. But LA, from what I believe about it, and from what mostly the country believed, was a very experimental place, not just in architecture and engineering, but, you know, in movies, in advertising, in everything. It was very dynamic, and it was certainly a lot freer from tradition. You know, we weren't tied down by, like, you got to build it like we did in Boston 100 years ago. You know, that sort of attitude wasn't there. It was filled with people who came out here so they could be free. And Honolulu was the same way, too. Honolulu at that time didn't have the tremendous volume of work, but it was very free. And I just accepted it as for what it was. I wasn't thinking about, well, is this different than the rest of the country? You know, it's just that was the kind of air I breathed. And so I didn't really spend that much time philosophizing about it.
who were some of the architects that were working in LA at that time that were coming up with some different ideas?
Well, of course, first of all, you have the housing guys, and they were doing very experimental stuff, like Neutra. You know, today you look at a Neutra house and you think, oh, you know, so what's so great about this? Well, what you don't realize is you're looking at the first time it was ever done. And, you know, he opened it up. He brought the garden into the house, so to speak, and did all kinds of pioneering things, which became so widely accepted that you forget they weren't always here. And then there was Schindler, whom I never met and never worked with. And he was a very free spirit. I remember I went over to Schindler's place on Kings Road a couple times to try to talk to the guy. And first of all, I couldn't find the front door. He's got bamboo all around it. And so I just wandered around and finally walked in through a bedroom in the back. And I walk up to the front and I see some drafting tables, but nobody at them. And I see bottles of wine around and half-empty glasses and everything. There's obviously been a party there the night before. I never found a human being. So then, I don't know, a year later, I went back on the same thing. I still couldn't find the front door. He had giant bamboo, about 5 inches in diameter, and all thick around the house, and you felt like you were going to get attacked by a tiger. And so I never met Schindler, never worked with him.
What about Lautner?
Well, of course, Lautner, yes. And then Lautner was doing a lot of residential. In fact, I think his practice was probably entirely residential at that time. And he was doing very far out things. And Lautner was a kind of a frustrated engineer. He'd never taken engineering. He never took architecture, though. He worked for Frank Lloyd Wright. And when you worked for Frank Lloyd Wright, you didn't get paid. You breathed the air of the great master, and that meant that you were intelligent. And Lautner did get paid. He actually got paid by Frank Lloyd Wright, which is almost unheard of. And Lautner really loved engineering, but I don't think he'd ever taken an engineering course. So he really had to struggle with just intuition, which was faulty in that it didn't have broad experience with all kinds of different materials. And so when Lautner and I met, I remember the first job I did for him. It was the Sheets residence in Westwood. And I have some beautiful framing pictures of it, which show it under construction, and it's got a beautiful geometry to it of all these studs and wood members, which, if I say so, part of it was my determination. And I got along with him so well on that, and he liked the results so much that I started doing all his engineering. And I did everything then that he did for several years, or quite a few years after that. And he was, of course, a very experimental guy. And the only reason why I finally quit doing engineering for him is that I really had to, because my practice had grown to where I was doing big buildings. And a house is so individualistic that it requires personal attention. With a big building, if you tell the client, you got to have a column here, he thinks, oh, the engineer says I got to have a column, I got to have a column. With a house, if you said I got to have a column right here, he'd say, no, it's right in the middle of the living room, I can't stand it. And you'd have to work around it. And so you can't just turn it over to an employee. And so I saw that I just couldn't do the small buildings and the big buildings anymore. And so, of course, I let the small ones go and did the big ones. But Lautner was a very creative guy, one of the best. And then you get away from the residential and you get into the commercial and the industrial. And there, I can't think of any one guy that was outstandingly ahead of the rest. If you suggest some names, I'll be able to tell whether I think that those guys did that. But they would all get occasional buildings. Beckett would get them. Luckman would get them. Pereira would get them. A.Q. Jones got them. And there were other guys too. I'm sorry I'm leaving their names out.
A.C. Martin?
Yes, A.C. Martin. A.C. Martin did some very good buildings. And A.C.
Can I just ask you, did you feel like that you and Lautner had a shared aesthetic in any way?
Share in what?
Aesthetic or a shared sensibility when you were working with Lautner?
I'm sorry, I don't.
Did you like feel that you and John Lautner like shared an aesthetic or a sensibility of
Oh,
styles
well,
that
yes.
you liked?
Yes, yes. That when we were working together, Lautner would come up with ideas, some of which made sense, and some of which didn't. And like, I remember he came up with one idea where he wanted to do a building using sections of sewer pipe where you take, they fit together, bell and spigot. And he wanted to use them. And they really didn't apply because you can't connect the joints together solidly enough for a building in an earthquake. Pipe in the ground is a different matter. And so, yes, what I learned to do with Lautner is I never said, no, that won't work. I would always explain to him why it wouldn't work. And he really liked that about me because I was kind of educating him in engineering. And he could see the reasons I was giving, and they made sense to him. And so he really liked that. So yes, we did have a feedback back and forth together. I don't know. Have you got any other names? Albert C. Martin was a good one. Albert C. Martin at that time had a very good structural engineer running his office. He had his own engineering office. In fact, come to think of it, Albert C. Martin has always had good engineers running his office. Oh, and of course, he had the two brothers, Al Martin, the architect. They both went to the college in the Midwest, University of Illinois, I think it is, where they have an engineering architecture degree. And that was the younger brother, Edward. Edward and I worked at Pearl Harbor together. And Al, I think, worked somewhere else during the war. But the idea was that he'd have these two brothers, one being the architect, one being the engineer, be the perfect people to take over his practice. The problem was, Al Martin did it, Al Martin Jr. He was very serious, very hardworking, and very competent. And Ed Martin never really took to it like his older brother did. And so it never really became mutual contributions from the two of them. It was the contribution of Al Martin that really made the building. And Ed just died here not too many years ago. And I knew him back at Pearl Harbor.
So you had a few different degrees. You got your undergraduate, tell us, you got your undergraduate degree and then you ended up going back to school?
Yeah, then I picked up a master's degree.
So start by just telling us your undergraduate, what year you got your undergraduate degree and what it was in.
Well, my undergraduate degree was at Caltech, and it was technically civil engineering, but it was mostly oriented towards structure, and that was the only part that really interested me. I wasn't interested in hydraulics and surveying and stuff like that, but structure I could see had real interesting stuff to do. And then after I got my degree at Caltech in 1939, I had to go out in the world to make a living. My father wasn't going to support me anymore. And so then I went to Honolulu, and the war ended, and I came back here, and I opened my own business. And then I started going back to school, as I've explained. And when I went back to school, I was accumulating credits toward a master's in structure, which I finally got a master's in structures at USC. And then I kept on going to school, and we have a pretty good school right over here about a mile away of Cal State Northridge. And I went there, and then I got a degree in applied mechanics, which is more advanced than ordinary structures. And then I kept on, I started going to UCLA just because they had the courses I wanted to take. And I finally ended up taking all the courses for a PhD, but I wasn't going to take a year out of my life and go to developing some kind of a project for them. And so that was the end of my degrees. But I enjoyed going to school.
Did you go back to USC later on for?
Oh, later on I taught it at USC. Yes, later on I became a visiting professor in, I forget what they call it, the special structures or something like that, where we handled unusual stuff. Shells had come in by that time, so we were able to get into shells and space structures and cable structures and anything that was different. We discussed there. So yes, I did teach there for a few years.
Did you get a degree in aeronautical engineering?
No.
Okay.
No, I relied on aeronautical engineering because they were doing the most advanced and complicated stuff. But no, there are too many things in aeronautical engineering that I had no interest in. You know, like power structures for airplanes and rockets and stuff. I mean, I wasn't ever going to get into anything like that.
Okay. And I realized we forgot when we were talking about Lautner that you worked on the Googie helping with that. So
yeah.
Tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, well, Googie's was a very small store, a very small shop, actually, on Sunset Boulevard, either right next door or very close to Schwab's drugstore. And Schwab's, of course, was a famous drugstore where Lana Turner was discovered and all that. And the frontage of the Googie property was only about 30 feet or so. And Lautner was given the job of making I guess you'd call it a coffee shop out of this space. And the problem, as he saw it, and I think he was correct, was who's going to notice this little 40-foot thing on Sunset Boulevard, cars whizzing by, and all this famous history and well-known buildings around. So he decided he had to do something to really attract attention. So he he made the roof on the building take a big bend and then sweep up in the air about 30 feet or so, higher than the building itself, to stop people driving down Sunset Boulevard into seeing this sudden sort of a billboard that's a part of the structure of the building. It was really a good idea. And the name of the owner was Googie, and so he did this, and it started, or I shouldn't say it started, but it was a part of, and one of the forerunners of a whole bunch of attraction gathering, cheesy buildings that had no real valid architectural purpose, but were designed just to catch attention and make money. And an interesting thing is that at this time, I think it was Architectural Forum, which was a Time Life product that was in existence for quite a few years after the war. It finally went out of business. And it might not have been Architectural Forum, it might have been Architectural Record, but I don't think it was. Architectural Forum did a feature on Lautner right at the time Googie's came out. And at the same time, the word Googie became a kind of a synonym for cheesy architecture, and still is. Well, strangely enough, the same magazine, the same issue that did the serious article on Lautner did a sardonic article on Googie architecture, which was and Lautner was the kind of the speaker for it. Not really the speaker. He didn't particularly advocate it, but his name became connected with it. They picked up the word Googie because it's a funny word. And so in the same magazine, he's covered both as a serious architect and as the leader of this kind of low-class architecture. And so Googie architecture is still around, the words are around today, although I don't think anybody really uses it for that regard to any specific buildings today. But that's how it all started. Oh, and incidentally, when we got down to the building department, the LA building department at that time had a very dictatorial guy running it, an empire builder. And he was trying to build himself up as being a really big part of the series, of the city. And so he was enforcing all kinds of obscure laws and really making it tough to get a permit in LA. And so he meaning, you know, his employees, see this building come in. It's very weird, very different. And they didn't want to give a permit on it, but they couldn't figure out anything wrong with it. I had made it conform to the laws, and they couldn't find any way to stop it, but they didn't want to give a permit. So finally, the employee took the plans that we were trying to get the permit on and disappears with them. And he comes back in about a half an hour, and he says, the head of the department has declared that this building's a hazard and it can't be built. He didn't say you violated regulation so-and-so. And we said, what? And he said, yeah, it can't be built. He just stopped it, cold, and without any, usually they list the violation, just like a traffic cop writing you a ticket. You got to violate something. And so Lautner and I didn't know what to do. We weren't able to talk to the guy that had rejected it. So we went away. We didn't have a permit. And then, I don't know, time went by, not too much, I don't know, a week or something. And we went back and we argued with him. And this time it went through and we got the permit. Because I guess they figured out you can't just stop somebody by saying it's a hazard. And why is it a hazard? I don't know, it's just a hazard. You know? And so we finally got the permit. But that shows you the kind of the hostility that we got from the building department in those days. It was a very tough building department, worst probably in the world. They had 1,500 employees. They weren't all checkers. A lot of them were, but a lot of them were inspectors, and they inspected, of course, for plumbing and everything else. That's a lot of people to be hired by the city.
Was it because the building was just so different that he didn't know what to make of it? Why do you think it was rejected initially?
I think because it was so unusual that he figured, and there were quite a few engineers thought this way, that this is different and there's got to be something wrong with it, and it's going to fall down somehow, but I'm not sure how. I think that's really what it was. Yeah. I ran across that a lot in shells. I'd get the same attitude. And when you'd say, well, they're doing them in South America, gravity's the same. They may have different kind of earthquakes, but they have earthquakes. And I don't know that it just didn't. There was a lot of hostility toward doing unusual things. I remember I gave a talk once before the Structural Engineers Society on shells back when they were really new. And one of my employees was there, and he walked out the door behind a bunch of other engineers that were leaving when they left, and he heard them talking. And he said these two old guys were saying, well, you know, it's never going to work. I don't care. and that you ran across that all the time, all the time. Not anymore, you don't.
Would you like some water for a second?
Oh no, I don't need it. If you
Okay.
need some, go
Are you
ahead and get
okay,
it.
Francois?
Yeah, I'm good.
Do you hear the noise of his shoes at
I
all?
do hear a little bit of noise when you have your hands on the
Oh,
microphone like this.
oh, you
It's
should have
okay,
said
it's okay. It's
something.
No,
just
it's
from
fine.
time to time.
And do you
No,
hear,
I don't want to
do you want him
interrupt.
to uncross his feet?
No, I don't see that. No.
Okay.
But
You
I
don't-
see
do
you
you-
when you lean over.
Okay.
No, no,
Do you-
I'll keep my hands over
No,
here.
you can bring them over. It's fine. Just don't touch the microphone. That's all.
Oh yeah, that must be awful.
No,
Yeah.
I don't.
With the shoes?
No, I don't
Okay,
hear.
all right. So, let's swing into the LAX Team Building, because it's interesting to me, sometimes people refer to that as like Googie architecture or Populux or something. So tell me about the development of the LAX Team Building.
Yeah. Well, here's the way it came about.
Will you start off by,
Pardon?
telling me the name of the building?
Oh yeah, the LAX Team Building, the restaurant building at the airport, LA Airport, that's up on the arches, and the way that came about is that it started out that all the buildings at the airport, they were building a whole new airport, not just the theme structure, and all the buildings were to be shells. And I was the only guy around LA that really had any experience in shells. So they came to me for the engineering, the structural engineering. And this was 3 very big architectural firms, very well known. Pereira and Luckman, they were partners at that time. Welton Beckett and Paul Williams. And so we started out with all kinds of shells that we were doing. And we went down to the building department with our preliminary drawings. And the primary designer among the architects on this was Pereira. The other architects, in fact, meaning Beckett and Luckman, Pereira's partner, and Paul Williams, had really nothing to do with the design. It was turned over to Bill Pereira. And so Pereira and I, a few other people, went down to the building department. And the building department, with his hostility to new ideas at that time, gave us very severe criticisms of trying to use shells in Los Angeles in an earthquake area. And to my surprise, when this happened, Bill Pereira, this is after we left the building department and came back to our offices, said, well, I guess we can't do it. They don't really want us to. And I was stunned. I thought, well, we go ahead and fight him, but he didn't want to, and it was his design. So they gave up the shells, and which meant that the main reason why I was chosen no longer made sense. But I was signed up under contract by that time, and I'd spent a lot of time on it with these preliminaries. And so Pereira came up with an entirely different design, which is the current design, and that was approved by everybody. Everybody liked it, with the arches and all. And so that is what I engineered. And we worked on it, I don't know, I suppose close to a year. Not I say on it, I mean on the whole airport. There were a lot of other buildings down there. And it got built. It wasn't excessively expensive or anything. And there it stood. Well, while it was being built, before it had the plaster on the arches are steel, and the arches have a constant cross-section, meaning they don't taper like the plastered finished version does. A wind came up and set off a vibration where the arches vibrated perpendicular to the wind. This is a very peculiar phenomena that was known in the airplane industry, but was not known in the design of buildings before, because people weren't doing buildings of this type before. And I happened to be in South America at the time this happened, in Rio, and I got a call from my employee telling me what had happened. And at that time, I really didn't know what it was. And so I came back, and we got to work on it. And here again, I relied on working with aeronautical engineers. I got together with them, and they explained it, and I could see what it was, and we started trying to prevent it. And at that time, there wasn't enough known how to prevent it in an architectural structure. It was known how to prevent it in aircraft because it had to be prevented. And we tried everything. Theoretically, we tried everything we could. And the only way we could prevent the vibration was to tie it off with wires at the midpoints. They weren't obtrusive, they're thin wires, but nevertheless, they're there and you could see them. But we didn't want them, and that was the way it was done. And that worked okay. And then the years went by, and just here a few years ago, when they replastered it, they called in some new structural engineers. I mean, they weren't new because 50 years had gone by, but some structural engineers from San Francisco. And they see the wires there, and they think that they were a part of the original concept, which they weren't. By this time, Pereira had died. His protege, Jin Wang, was taking over the redesign and the replastering and everything. And so the new engineers never asked me, they probably didn't even know I was alive, were the wires really necessary? I wanted them to get rid of the wires. But by the time I finally went over to Jin Wang's office and talked to him, they were committed. And they spent a whole bunch of time and put computers on it and everything, and proudly announced that the wires were needed, and they justified them. And so they put the damn wires back in. And I wanted to eliminate them, but I never got a chance to talk. And so the wires are still there, and everybody thinks it was planned from the beginning, and it wasn't. They were to cover up a fact that we got caught with something that we just had no experience with.
So initially, the theme building was supposed to be kind of the central hub for the whole airport, right? Wasn't everybody going to go through?
Oh,
Was that the initial idea?
Not necessarily. Of course, back when they did this years and years ago, the airports weren't as well known to design as they are today. And so, it was never anything more than just a restaurant. It was anticipated that people would use it who were catching flights. And actually, I think probably most of their clientele is people just going to it because it's so unusual. And it was to be in the center, all right, but that was just so that it would be the center of attention. And of course, since then, it's become almost like the symbol of Los Angeles. And they have put out postcards, and there's a book written on it. And so it's a very well-known building all over the world now.
And was it initially, did it rotate?
No, it was never intended to rotate. The reason why is that there's no point in rotating it. If you rotate, you should be seeing different views, and the things in the middle of the airport and what you're going to see are different cars. So it's not it's not that scenic. It's not as if we got a beautiful ocean view and a mountain view and things like that. So no, it was never intended to rotate.
Okay. And everybody always says, they always say, oh, it's like the Jetsons or like the Martian spaceship, because wasn't Hal
Yeah, well, that's something they're reading into it. I don't think Pereira ever felt that way about it. And incidentally, then many years later, Paul Williams, some of his relatives, saw his name on the drawings, and of course Beckett's name was on it, and Luckman's name, everybody's name, even though really the only guy who really knew everything about that airport was Pereira. The other guys just let him do it. And assumed that because his name was on it, he must have designed the theme building. And Paul Williams never had anything to do with the theme building, nothing whatsoever. And he would never have claimed it. I don't think he did claim it. In fact, I think he said he deliberately said he didn't do anything with it. And it was not his type of thing at all. And it all just came from some of his relatives making that assumption. But it was entirely Bill Pereira's design.
And so who was James Langenheim? He worked, James...
Oh, yeah, no, Jim was one of the workers on it. I don't know whether Jim was in charge of the design or not. If you have records saying he was, then he was. And Jim was working for Pereira and Luckman at that time. And Jim became the architect years later on that gigantic house of Spellings. It's 55,000 square feet or something, which is more than an acre. And Jim was the architect on it.
So can you tell me the year that the theme building was built, and then some technical, like the span of the arches is like 350 feet, or can you give me some
I think it was built in 1961. Excuse me. And the span of the arches, I really don't remember exactly. I think it is around 300 feet. And
I have, the arches have an overall span of 350 feet.
how about
And
350?
Yeah, and that the restaurant cantilever's 35 feet from the concrete core.
Oh, well, those dimensions are probably right.
So can you start again, and will you tell me the year it was built? And
1961. And if I guess it was 350 feet, the span of the arches from the ground on one side to the ground on the other side, and the deck on which the restaurant is built cantilevers somewhere around 35 feet.
And the vortex shedding, does that relate to when you had the wind problem? What's the vortex shedding? How does that?
Yes, well, yes, I didn't want to get too technical, but it's technically called vortex shedding. And I'm trying to think of where you'd get a practical idea of this. The thing that the example that's usually given is that anybody who's rowed a boat has noticed little whirlpools coming off the tips of the oars, and that is the same vortex shedding, only it's occurring in water. And I don't use that example because it really doesn't explain how that would apply to the arches. But what it amounts to, and it's a very strange phenomenon. We duplicated it with a little fan in the office, where we just took a fan that we had, regular floor fan, and we put a little cross-section of the arch up in front of it and got it vibrating, and sure enough, it vibrated, but we got it at the right speed. It vibrated vertically. You would expect it to vibrate in the direction the wind is blowing. You blow on something, you expect it to blow over in the direction of the wind. But with vortex shedding, the member at a certain resonance speed, where the speed of the wind coincides with the rate of vortex shedding, you get a reinforcement which makes the arch vibrate horizontally. It's only when it resonates with the wind. The resonant wind at the airport was, as I believe, 28 miles an hour. And that at 28 miles an hour, the arches would start vibrating harmonically with the wind. And I never saw it because by the time I got back from South America, we were already working on stopping it. But my employee told me that it only took like about a half a minute, and the arch was vibrating quite violently, up and down, like 6 inches or more, with a very noticeable effect on the big concrete drum at the center of it, that it was making the drum move back and forth. And we figured, our figures showed that when the plaster was put on, this was going to stop. It was going to stop it. But the problem was we had nothing else to compare it with. Nothing of this type had ever been built before and subject to this vortex shedding. And since it reached a maximum very quickly, like in less than a minute, if our indication, our calculations weren't right, and we weren't that sure of them, there wasn't that much information available, we wouldn't be able to stop it. You know, it would start cracking the plaster and doing damage. And so that is when we reluctantly concluded we had to add the wires. It was the only way we could prevent it. But yes, you're right, it's a vortex shedding.
And the thing is, it definitely had a very futuristic look to it. So, you know, at that time, the whole idea of the jet age and aerospace and it being an airport, can you talk about what that, you know, what that moment was like? Because that was definitely something that was new.
Well, that was Pereira employing his imagination. He also did the Transamerica building in San Francisco, which is futuristic looking. And he got into that sort of thing, and he was very good at it. And I think it's obvious that what he conceived of with the airport was accurate because of the continuing popularity of the thing. And he was one of the few that was going off in that direction. There weren't a lot of guys doing it. And he did a lot of far out buildings.
Do you remember how much steel was used in the building?
Oh, you mean in tonnage?
Yeah.
No, I don't, but it was nothing particularly of interest. The building is part concrete and part steel, so the amount of steel wouldn't really mean much. It wasn't a huge amount.
Yeah, 900 tons.
I really don't know.
So, just one question about like the way the structure is, because it seems like it's kind of like one single piece, but it's really, that's kind of an illusion, isn't it? It's like the arches are like 4 steel reinforced things that are come together, right?
Well, the arches, actually, the steel arches above the deck, above the restaurant, do not support the structure. They are decorative. The structure is the arches below, that are below the level of the airport. I mean, below the level of the restaurant.
So here's some of the.
Oh, yeah.
So what is this? Is
Yeah, okay, this picture which shows the central drum in concrete built, and that drum is a foot thick, and so it's a very strong object, and the arches are coming into it, and this shows the structural part of the arches. This level of the arches is actually carrying all of the forces that support the building. The arches above this level are decorative. Yes, this shows all the arches up and shows the framing of the deck, the roof, and the floor of the restaurant. And yeah, nothing's plastered yet. Yes, here they are putting the plaster on, and to my surprise, they decided to scaffold everything all at once and plaster everything all at once. I would have assumed they would have done sections of it and then moved on, but they didn't. So you get this very interesting picture of all this temporary material built around it. And on each side in this picture are rows of cylindrical shells, which I think are probably close to the earliest shells built in the United States. They're, again, I don't want to claim they're the first, but I mean, they're the first as far as I know. Yeah, well, this is more of the plastering scaffolding. Yeah, here it looks like it's pretty well complete.
What was the reaction to the build? What was the response? Did people immediately like it, or did they think it was a little bit weird, or?
Well, among the professionals, some thought it was kind of googy, that there were aspects to it that really weren't needed architecturally. Well, I mean, the arches above the deck. And others liked it. And then among laymen, I think it attracted their attention. You know, they'd never seen anything like that. Who's ever seen a building like this before, you know? You know, your pictures are really bad.
Yeah, they're just printouts from the computer.
Oh, because...
we have the real drawing, we have the real photographs.
Yeah, yeah, because they're a lot better. I got
Yeah.
better pictures of
Yeah.
this, yeah.
These are just, I just printed these
Oh,
out.
yeah, there's
just to
a
give
night
you
picture,
reference.
yeah.
I know you have,
Yeah, they did a great job with the night lighting.
yeah. the
I
night
mean, at
lighting.
night, it's a beautiful building.
Well, also, it seems like they utilize the lighting for the front entrance now too, with those lit columns, you know, it connects.
Oh, yeah, they did that, yeah, yeah.
So when they did the renovation, it was Disney who did the renovation. What did you think of when they redid the building?
Well, of course, you know, I'm disappointed they didn't realize that they should have tried to eliminate those wires and get back to the original scheme. But instead of that, they were real proud how they were able to include them in the engineering. So they'll be there forever now. Oh, and incidentally, you know, quite a few years ago, Holmes and Narver, I think it was, which are primarily an engineering firm, did a new control tower or something near the entrance to the theme structure. It's still there, and they too assumed the wires must mean something, so they put some dumb wires in their design that are just obviously doing nothing. I think they're even hanging kind of loose, just because they thought, oh, well, wires are something that are part of the design. Let's put wires in. And they just got some wires hanging there that mean absolutely nothing on their building.
That's so funny. Here, I can take that. I was reading when in the 1961, the whole project was called the Los Angeles Jet Age Terminal Construction Project.
Oh, I don't recall hearing that.
Yeah. So there was really
that
this
title.
idea of, the space.
I don't remember them using the term jet age with it at that time, but maybe they did.
I guess maybe that's something, that we put on it too, this space age futuristic design, but it seems like that was in the air.
Well, I guess it was, yeah. Everybody knew we were going to be sending rockets out. And, I don't think they talked about putting a man on the moon yet, but yeah, everybody figured that, we're going to be tearing around out in the universe pretty soon.
Yeah. And what was because it was such a collaborative project with all the different architects. You mentioned that Paul Williams wasn't really involved, but what was it like to work with the others, or really was it Pereira's firm that just took the lead?
Well, to tell you the truth, here's what really happened. These architectural firms were shotgunned together. In other words, they didn't get together and say, let's go get the airport job. They were shotgunned together by the politicians of the airport. And it was a very prestigious job, and but they really didn't enjoy working with each other. So they set up an independent office of their own, divorced from all three of their offices. It's at the corner of, I think, Beverly and La Cienega. At that time, there was a great big vacant lot there. And there was a big office, and that became the office for the airport, and the whole airport was designed out of that office. And there was only one of the partners permanently stationed at that project, at that airport, at that location. And that was Pereira. And Pereira just took over the whole job, and it was designed entirely under his jurisdiction and his creation. And I think the other guys were all perfectly happy to just stay away from it. I never saw any one of them there other than Pereira. I met with Pereira there more times than I can remember, and I never saw any one of the other ones there. And I never got any feedback like, we got to change something because, well, Beckett doesn't like it or something like that. I never got that. So I think they were all perfectly happy to just sort of do other work in their office and pay attention to that. So that is the way it was designed. And Pereira did a good job. He worked full time for over a year on it.
What does the term structural elegance mean?
Well, structural elegance is something, excuse me.
Would you like some
That-
water?
Yes, I would.
I'm going to change battery.
Okay.